business model of innovation oftentimes takes existing innovation, not always creating new things or new research or new products, but taking the pieces and putting them together in a creative way to target a new market, create a new service. And so what can industry and organizations do as we move forward into this new model of the new systems of global trade?
Please join me in welcoming global competitive strategist Amy Karam on crisis or opportunity, how we can turn today's pressures into tomorrow's competitive edge. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here today. It is one of my favorite topics, of course, and I'm glad that Canada's paying attention to this very important topic. So we titled it Crisis or Opportunity for a couple of reasons. We've just finished the elections. Prime Minister Carney has repeated over and over that we are in a crisis. And now, since the elections are over, the cabinet has been named, we move into opportunity. How do we capitalize on this crisis to invoke the change that we can in order for us to redefine Canada's position in the future going forward? All right, so happenings. I'm not going to rehash too much of what we've been experiencing firsthand, but it was really how do we say, a new awakening, right, of patriotism, of angry Canadians. Canadians aren't usually angry, but the USA/President Trump tariffs and new trade rules that he's introduced in his first 100 days really stirred up Canadians. And as many of you know, right, it had ripple effects. Loved seeing how people were just buying Canadian in stores, etc. So from that, we went to being super hopeful to the first meeting that Prime Minister Carney had. And thankfully that went well. President Trump seems to really respect him, which of course will relay into positive things for Canada, we hope. What I wanted to really highlight is that the President Trump tariffs really aren't Canada's biggest problems, right? He really just burst the bubble that Canada has been living in for quite some time. And of course, why not? When things are going really well, why shake the trees? Why make some change when you don't need to? Now we need to. So let's take a look at some of the things that we're in this bubble. Why are we all of a sudden finding ourselves to be very vulnerable to President Trump's new movements? Some of the things that we've maybe areas for improvement, say, for Canada, or areas that we found weaknesses, especially in this new paradigm, is the global trade landscape has changed and shifted. The G7 no longer really rule. The G20, including a lot of emerging markets, giants, are rising in terms of impact, and that has changed our systems, our trading systems. So free markets, for example, no longer dictate economic growth necessarily. And new systems, say from China or Russia or others, are shifting the way we do business. And so we find ourselves taking a look at how we've been, maybe say in the last 3 decades or more. How has Canada been operating? So if we take a look at, say, innovation, from the innovation perspective, we've really been very cerebral. We are excellent at market research, at discovery. And this is not just me saying this. These are global innovation indices. They're saying we rate really high on research or inputs, but we rate pretty low on outputs or commercialization, monetization of this innovation and IP. And so what that means is we create things, we research things, we write a lot of papers, and then other nations that might be more entrepreneurial or they like to capitalize on these findings. We help others gain a competitive advantage, which ultimately leaves us with a competitive disadvantage. Or we don't move our economic needle as far or as fast as, say, maybe other nations who take advantage or capitalize on some of this intellectual capital. So these are some of the things that really put us in a vulnerable position. And as you've heard many times with President Trump, he likes to identify who's got what leverage, and he likes to use his leverage. These factors have contributed to Canada having less leverage in negotiating in some cases. However, we have seen identification of some of these leverage points, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So why should government care about private sector dynamics? So, government is here. Industry is very excited about the new government and the new cabinet being introduced. But how much should we expect them to do? And why should they do more? Well, what we're realizing is that public sector and private sector are very closely entwined now. Because free markets no longer rule in global competitiveness dynamics and systems, we've seen some of these happening, say, in the technology world, which is an area that I'm very comfortable in. Let's go back to 5G, maybe 5 to 8 years ago when it was rising. Free markets or the technology industry in the USA, in Canada, in the UK, didn't establish a position as a primary network vendor or company for 5G networking equipment. That enabled Huawei to rise to the top into number 1 and number 2 positions. And then we found ourselves listening to the United States sounding the warning bells and saying, this is a national security threat for all of our communications to be running over China, a Chinese company's network. Do we really want to pursue that? So then the alarm bells went off. They talked to all the allies and asked everybody to rip out their Huawei purchases. Okay, so all this to say, this was a national security risk, right? So not only did we, from an economic security perspective, miss out on this technology trajectory of 5G and not establish ourselves as a world leader. We used to have Nortel. Due to lack of industrial policy at the time, Nortel and its intellectual property and intellectual capital was dispersed and fizzled out. So Huawei came in and filled the void. All this to say, innovation, national security, economic security, it's all intertwined. And that's why more than ever, we need to work together, public sector, private sector, and industry organizations, et cetera, right? So what does Canada need to do now? Canada needs to start operating like a company. We need to start taking inventory of all our assets. I coined this term of CE small s O, a Chief Economic Security Officer. And I'm optimistic that Prime Minister Carney is going to take this kind of an attitude towards putting Canada back on a stronger track. Industrial strategy typically doesn't have a very positive connotation with a lot of economists or some of the existing system leaders. But I dubbed this as industrial strategy 2.0, meaning let's change how it's been. It's not supposed to, it shouldn't be a dictatorial industrial strategy, but a more collaborative strategy where the government leads in inviting private sector or industry to the table, and collectively we decide what are our key priorities? What are the areas of, what are the centers of excellence that we're going to focus on? What is Canada going to be known for, so that we don't have to necessarily pursue partners in trade, but we will attract partners in trade. And as we define those centers of excellence, then different countries with different areas of expertise can come and participate with us as a leader in these designed areas of prioritization and differentiation, if you will. Also, as part of operating like a company, the country, the government, the federal government needs to start looking at the ROI on investments in research. And again, back to the 2.0, as we work more closely together, the government's done really well to invest so much in, say, the $2.4 billion that was allocated to AI last year, and the semiconductor industry. That's fantastic. It's really great movement towards the right direction. But let's also not put the onus on just industry or private sector to decide how that money will be allocated in order to raise Canada's global competitiveness bar. But let's decide together so that that top-down view can be stated, can be communicated, and then companies will, in turn, focus their efforts aligned with these top priority areas. Because private sector companies just, have a very siloed or micro view of what needs to happen. But with the government facilitating that broader engagement, then I think it'll help everyone march to the same more narrow paths that will help elevate Canada's success at home and abroad. And then the other value add by the Canadian government taking charge is really articulating the geopolitical risk guidance for companies. So the drum has been beating. Companies need to diversify, go abroad. Well, let's help companies anticipate what are some of the geopolitical risks of country X, Y, Z. And not only the geopolitical risks, but now we have to start anticipating those longer sales life cycle. It's going to take us a longer time to establish those contacts in some of those other countries, build the trust and loyalty of other customers in other countries. There's a whole change in our expectation on how quickly or how safely business will happen as we diversify. And it's key for the government to help and guide companies accordingly by naming those entities and the outcomes of each. And so what can industry and organizations do as we move forward into this new model of the new systems of global trade? Well, I encourage us all to practice business model innovation. How can you do business differently? How can you learn how to monetize your assets in different and creative ways? I wrote about business model innovation about a decade ago, starting a decade ago, when I noticed and I studied how Chinese companies were rising and how China gained a lot of traction and very quickly. Business model of innovation oftentimes takes existing innovation, not always creating new things or new research or new products, but taking the pieces and putting them together in a creative way to target a new market or to create a new service. Xiaomi's mobile phone was a really great example. They used the iPhone look and feel. They used Android's operating system, and they even recruited Google's VP of product to come over to China for 4 years. And then they modified the go-to-market strategy based on the different countries they were exporting in. They essentially had no marketing or very little marketing in China proper because they did crowdsourcing and invited their fans or their customers to have live chats with executives and tell them what they needed and what they wanted. So it's really taking what you've got and finding new ways to monetize a lot of these assets instead of just always focusing on creating the next greatest product. Another way that industry can help Canada and themselves is moving up the value chain. How can we get more into the production of some of our raw commodities instead of sending, say, grains and fuel to get processed in another country and sometimes buying it back? How can we, work with government to get help entities or organizations who might be smaller and need those economies of scale to move that production and that desire to add more revenue to the value chain, through collaboration. Now, this is also going to lend to economic security and national security. If you're in the food business, for example, it's very scary that 80% of our food sources come from outside of Canada. What if we had a similar crisis as we did with COVID-19 and the supply chains were hugely jeopardized? These are all things that we, again, collectively have to work at, not just from an industry trying to increase revenues, but government really caring and paying attention so that we can lend to those national security concerns. And then, of course, industry and organizations need to diversify customers and their geopolitical risk. So I put organizations here in the title intentionally because there's a lot of research organizations or innovation or academic institutions. And it's not enough anymore for us to create cool things or invest in innovation that might be important in some small sector. It's really important to identify who's going to use it and what are the repercussions of not doing project X versus how can we redeploy certain projects going forward. So diversifying customers, yes, we need to go abroad, but and yes, we need to collaborate, but we also need to pay a lot of heed to our partners and really doing that homework on geopolitical risk. Canadians are really nice, and sadly, sometimes we feel like if we show up nice and respectful, that we'll get that in return, and it's not always the case. So we need to be prepared. And then I like to use this word co-opetition. If you can't beat them, join them. Co-opetition is basically that formula of cooperation and competition. How can you get that sweet spot with either peers in your own industry domestically or some of your competition abroad? How can you leverage each other's pieces while also building your own area of expertise, protecting your IP while also exchanging it? And how can you maybe acquire some of the foreign competition to secure some of those supply chains? Maybe you look at diversification might be also in purchases, right? Purchasing some of the foreign entities that can give you that security and give ultimately Canada that economic and national security sentiment. And then learning from other countries. I can't emphasize this enough. We have often been a leader in educating, in co-research, in the labs, et cetera. They've learned, a lot of other countries have learned a lot from Canada. And I encourage us to be more curious about how do other countries do business? How do they do innovation? I know that when I was in Silicon Valley for 15 years, I saw the busloads of folks, and this is probably about 10 plus years ago, busloads of foreigners coming from China, coming from Korea, coming from, you name it, a lot of European countries as well. They wanted to learn what was the secret sauce for the Silicon Valley to innovate. How did they How do they innovate so well? Why were they so creative? Well, I think it's also time for us to start going abroad and see how they've advanced so that we can pepper in new practices in our own innovation and business practices. So just to close, I'd leave you with a couple of thoughts of how are you going to move the needle in your competitive strategy? What will you do differently? And I encourage us all to see the future now, right? So a lot of these things are not new. We're just really shocked because Canada and the USA had such a strong relationship, and I'm confident that it'll become closer as well, but it won't be the same anymore. So let us really pay attention to the trends and the new players and what is happening, and practice healthy paranoia a little bit, right? It's okay to, keep going along, but let's start changing. If it needs to be slowly, let's change slowly. But don't ignore the warning signs is what I would say. Take a look at who's really innovating out there. Right? There's a lot of research reports, and when I say who, it's which countries are really growing and in which areas. Who's really big in robotics and in automation, and that's another competitive advantage that you should be concerned about. If that's actually your supply, one of your suppliers or your sources, maybe learn from some of their techniques and start automating in your own shop, in your own industry. And always be intentional of your why. Invest in technology, but don't just do it because it's the in thing to do at this time. What is the ROI and what is the outcome? AI is the next big trajectory. How will you harness and capitalize AI while also, maintaining your talent pool, and maybe getting them trained up in new areas so that they grow and expand with this trajectory. So I'm just going to close with the statement of innovation is not just cool, it's a competitive advantage. So let's make choices wisely and do make the right investments in the right innovations so we collectively can grow. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. A really clear and thoughtful approach with guidance on kind of questions to ask internally and prompts for organizations to be thinking about. Really appreciate this. We're going to squeeze in some questions here if you've got a couple of minutes. A question with regards to leadership. As I mentioned, you've given some great prompts and referenced kind of a healthy paranoia. Can you give sample language that leaders could use within an organization to help their teams understand a new mindset going forward based on the situation that we're in?
Yeah, I would say is really framing it in the context of what happens if they don't, if they as an organization don't make those changes. We've had the luxury in the past of dabbling in things that we thought were interesting, or yeah, maybe or maybe not. I think consequences, and I don't mean that in a threatening way. I mean in an opportunity way, and also in an outcome-based way. What would the outcome be if we didn't do move X?
Got it.
That's how I would do it.
Thank you for that. And you referenced the food industry as an example, and we've got audience thinking also about the automotive industry has really been impacted by some of the changes going on. Any insight into some guidance for that industry?
Yeah, that's a huge one. And I think this is a really great example of how intertwined some industries can be, especially the automotive. And we saw the job cuts happen very quickly. Maybe it's an opportunity to take a look at some of their processes that they could start selling, diversifying their business models, not just making cars, but how they make cars. Maybe that can be a side business or an extension of them staying afloat, right? So sharing some of that intelligence in a monetary fashion with some of their competitors. That could be one way. And of course, naturally, how do they source other parts and sell their parts to other nations? That's the obvious one. But I think there's an opportunity to take a look at, again, some of this intelligence and the expertise that we have, and selling that as a service or as intellectual capital.
Thank you. And we have a question from JW. How can we stimulate Canadian companies to be more international and not only focused on the US?
Well, I would say funding sources is one way, because I think there's a lot of funding that happens from the government. I know that there's many contingencies to some of this funding, but I would make it a requirement, because it's not optional anymore. So I think that this would be again a business plan that would motivate those kind of benefits for a company.
Thank you so much for this, Amy. And we have one question about will the audience receive a copy of these slides? And indeed, we'll follow up this webinar with recording as well as sample takeaways so that you can revisit and try out some of those prompts and questions within your own organization. And of course, we would love to bring Amy right into your organization for a custom version of this presentation. So thank you again, Amy, and to our audience for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we hope you'll join us for our next speaker 2 weeks from today. We have New York Times bestseller of Performing Under Pressure, JP Palou-Fry, on his newest research, The Last 8%, Building a Culture of High Connection and High Courage in Your Organization. So watch for that invitation and the follow-up content for today's webinar. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.